Okay, we can go. No, we're gonna launch straight into the video, and then there's going to be welcoming remarks after the video. Okay, we're ready. Okay. Yeah. Good to go. Let's get this thing started. Okay.
Everything through our Dickie John system, we've been recording from storm to storm to see what our applications rates have been throughout the storm. So I can refine the truck driver, tell them, hey, listen, you're running at 250, 225.
If we get the system. Here, can I get it?
Everything through our Dickie John system, we've been recording from storm to storm to see what our applications rates have been throughout the storm. So I can refine the truck driver, tell them, hey, listen, you're running at 250, 225. We had onboard dash cams, so we could take pictures every 15 minutes to see the comparison with the tracking systems inside them, and then we were able to go to a dashboard with these technologies and see where the driver's application rates were to monitor everything. You know, when we started cutting the corners where we're seeing there was waste, where we didn't need to put down the extra material, and it's brought us to this point to where we've cut our usage, down by over 60%. But this year, now that we're dealing with freezing rain and ice, your application rates are going to go up. So we're going to have an influx of more usage, but it's the good and the bad. So now that's controlling your pounds per lane mile. And then the next one over is for your pre-wet system, the 3 gallons per minute. Sprays the rock at the rate that we needed to, and the driver pays attention to control his spreader amount, so this way he's not wasting his material, he's not throwing it all over the road, he's focusing on keeping it within his lane. So all these little things add up to saving waste on material and you having to activate and use the way it's supposed to during storms.
To it, and the mileage that they're doing. So the more I was doing it, the more we find I was coming. Like he treated 142 miles. He was 12.28 tons. His average was 172 pounds per lane mile. So you get into a different weather event. This is all light snow, light to moderate snow. So now his rates are different. He treated 252 miles. He was 16.73 tons.
You have to find a happy medium, and it comes down to road safety. Today everybody's so fast-paced, they're not laid back the way they used to. They want instant gratification, they want it now. When I first came up here, you could see that fast pace coming here. So they want that instant gratification, so you have to be out on it when the time they don't have to go out, please stay home. I understand you want to be somewhere, take your time, make sure you have the proper tires, in your car. The all seasons sometimes don't cut it, aqua treads don't cut it. We've been out in all various situations, and people like to drive fast. Slow down, take your time. If you don't have to go out, don't go out.
It can be done. 60% reduction. Let's have a hand for the town of Hague. I'm Tracy Ormsby. I'm the publisher of the Adirondack Explorer. Thank you all for joining us today, for coming over here. It's not a very sexy topic, but an important one for us here in the Adirondacks. So thank you for being here. And I want to thank our sponsors, the Adirondack Council and ADK Action, two organizations who have been working on this issue for a very long time and helped get behind the Randy Preston Road Salt Reduction Act, and which is now a law. So thank you to those two organizations, and thanks to the Wild Center for hosting us here today. And I want to do a shout out to some students here from Long Lake. They're studying science journalism, environmental economics, and environmental forensics. So thank you for being here. It's great to have some young people. You're going to take care of this for us in the future. So thanks for being here. I also want to acknowledge DOT and the highway crews for getting out there on the snowy and icy mornings to keep people safe, and also for being involved in trying to solve this issue. It doesn't make your jobs any easier, and so we really appreciate that you're here today too. And just a little bit about the next hour and a half. We're going to have a panel of folks who have been deeply involved in this issue, some of them on the Road Salt Reduction Task Force, which just came out with its report. So we're interested to talk with these folks and hear what's next. And leading the discussion will be award-winning reporter Zach Matson, who has been covering road salt and water issues here for the Adirondack Explorer for the last 2 years. So thank you, Zach, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. We can bring the panelists up, and we'll get going. So welcome, and thanks, everyone, for coming, and thanks to all the panelists who agreed to come and share their experience and their time with us. We have a great mix of people here who are deeply involved in this topic. So right here is AJ Smith from the State Department of Environmental Conservation. He is the Assistant Director of the Division of Water there and has studied chloride levels rising across the state and was involved in the task force. Next to him is Rob Voplis, who used to work as a plow operator with the town of Lake George and was deeply involved in that town's efforts to reduce their salt use, and is now a consultant with WIT Advisors, working with other communities around the park to do similar things. Next to him is Rob Fitch, who is with the State Department of Transportation. He is the Director of Transportation Maintenance there, where he helps manage the state's winter storm responses and their efforts to try to optimize their salt use. Between AJ and Rob, we have over 50 years of state government experience, so we can really appreciate that. Next to Rob is Sawyer Bailey. She's the Executive Director of ADK Action, where she leads the nonprofit's work to bring communities together to collaborate on this issue and to raise public awareness. Next to her is Chris Nowitzki. He's the Lake George Waterkeeper. He organizes an annual salt summit down there, so he's helped facilitate this conversation a lot, and he works with policymakers and communities to help protect water quality on Lake George. Next to him is Tracy Eldridge, who is the Hamilton County Superintendent of Public Works, and he served on the task force, and so did Chris, and Rob and AJ both helped with that a lot. And then we have Brendan Wiltsey at the very end. He is with the Adirondack Watershed Institute, where he's the lead research scientist on their water research, and he's led a lot of efforts to monitor the effects of salt on our lakes and our aquatic ecosystems. So I thought it was really fortuitous that Governor Kathy Hochul chose this week to announce this special conservation easement at Follinsby Pond, just a couple of miles from here where we sit. There's a 970-acre lake with a rare native lake trout population, and this easement is going to create this unique science preserve. It's going to bring in researchers from around the world to study the freshwater ecosystems of the Adirondack Park. And the plan's unveiled. It's going to showcase the Adirondack special ecology to researchers around the world. I think it's important context as we discuss how we use road salt in Adirondack Park, a necessary but harmful pollutant that finds its way into the water that flows in and out of lakes like Fallons Bee and so many others. These water bodies are what make the Adirondack so special and this conversation so important. So today we're going to try to look forward to what the path forward of continuing to reduce salt use in this park to protect our freshwater ecosystems and our drinking water looks like. So I'm going to start with the panelists and give them each a little time to sort of talk about where they're coming from on this, and then we're going to have a discussion back and forth with the panel, and then in the last half hour or so we'll open the floor to questions from you all. So think about those and get those ready. So AJ, DEC has been monitoring chloride concentrations for many years. Talk about what that data has taught us and sort of what you felt were some important takeaways from the task force.
Is that good? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. I'm not texting, I just have my notes on my phone, just for reference. That would be pretty awkward, right? Yeah, we've been studying, so I guess two parts to that question. First was, what are we seeing in terms of chloride statewide in the Adirondacks? And then the second part was about key findings, right? So I think in terms of our water quality data, the state Department of Environmental Conservation has probably one of the longest standing, most robust water quality monitoring programs in the nation. You know, we've been conducting water quality monitoring across New York since before the Clean Water Act was initiated, and then those same programs have been continuing ever since, right? And some of those locations that we've been monitoring have been in the same location every year since the start of those programs. So we do have a wealth of information across New York, including up in the Adirondacks. And a few years ago, we did I guess it may have been more than a few years ago now, I think around 2018 or so, we did an analysis of 40 years worth of water quality data. And one of the things that we thought we would find was that some of the pollutants like nutrients and things that we were seeing along the landscape were going to be on the increase, but surprisingly we identified that chloride was increasing and that we were surmising that it was being locked up in some of the groundwater and kind of being retained and then coming out into surface waters even at base flow conditions. So even without like big rain events, it was just sort of slowly trickling out throughout the rest of the year. So that was pretty concerning that we were seeing a lot of chloride across the landscape, across the state, and at higher concentrations than we had really expected. And it wasn't something that started, 40, 50 years ago. It was something that started only maybe 20 years ago. So it was this increase. We didn't really speculate as to the sources. We just sort of identified that there was this increase. And then with the task force, we ended up doing an analysis with the water quality data with the rest of the folks on the task force along with DOH to look at just the what we were seeing in those same sorts of data within the Adirondack Park. And I think we were identifying a similar trend, but that relative to the rest of the state, a lot of the water quality data, which we're glad to see it, is at lower concentrations. The contaminants are at lower concentrations in the Adirondacks, but nonetheless still having an impact, probably because of the more sensitive ecosystems that we have right in the Adirondack Park and in some more of our other upland forested ecosystems across the state. So we've been taking what we've been learning through those different analyses and starting to look into the information a little bit further. So we have a manuscript actually that our scientists in Division of Water had completed this past year, where it looks at the concentrations of chloride and other contaminants across the state, and hoping to be able to publish that pretty soon to see what it is we're seeing and get that out. So I think we've identified a major issue, an increasing trend in the concentration of chloride statewide, including in the Adirondacks, and it's something that we need to start to identify the various sources, including road salt. There may be some other sources in specific areas or regions of the state that that may also be contributing, and then start to think about solutions. And I think the road salt task force was a major component of the solution, right? Starting to look at best management practices and things that we can do to impact the actual application of road salt and probably reduce what I think we expect is the biggest source of chloride contamination. So hopefully that covers the first one. And then the second piece, I think, in terms of big findings or the biggest things that hit DEC coming out of the task force report were things like the need for funding, right? That municipalities that have their operations applying road salt to landscape need funding to be able to handle the best management practices and the storage capacity that we are recommending in the task force. And that funding needs to be widely accessible. And so that's a big takeaway for us, and it's something that we're starting to look at and leveraging the historic investments from the Clean Water Infrastructure Act funding and Environmental Protection Fund that we have in New York to try and make that funding available to pay for best management practice implementation. And then from me, because of my primary background on water quality standards and water quality data, is probably the desire and the need to update our water quality standards. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more. But we have some pretty outdated or lack of water quality standards at this point for chloride compared to a lot of other places, and we're working on reviewing that. And as the recommendation out of the task force report had suggested, and I think that was a big push forward for us, especially in Division of Water.
Awesome. It was a good outline. So, Rob, we saw this in the video a little bit, but when you go to these places that are, lowering their use and adopting a lot of these best practices, there's a lot of buy-in, a lot of passion. They kind of get competitive with each other. And, we hear about this idea of a culture change in these departments and in these garages is what's needed. So talk about that and sort of, how that happens, what that looks like, and sort of, what resources those communities need to really push that forward.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not a public speaker by any far. So we were at the town of Peru yesterday. 2 years ago, it was more of we were standing there teaching a class. Yesterday there was total engagement. So there's definitely a culture change with everything. There's interaction now. There's also, buy-in with the equipment operators, where before it was we're standing up teaching a class. Now it's they're totally engaged. They're asking questions. They're now looking and seeing issues that they didn't look and see before, and they're trying to develop problem-solving issues to problem-solve the issues. But to move forward, everybody's at a different level. There's definitely a discovery process that happens in the beginning. So everyone that we work with is definitely at a different level. And then as they grow, each one is kind of different. So we really look to see what their strengths and weaknesses are, because everyone really is dealing with something different. You really can't compare one group to another group. They all have different roads they're dealing with, different microclimates within their particular road network that they're dealing with. So it's really coming up with a custom program for each individual municipality or landscape client or whoever that best suits them, and so, and they're all going to be different, all different equipment they're using. So it's really utilizing what would be best for them or what they have. And a lot of these guys are really innovative. They see something and they find a solution. They might use some backwoods ingenuity, but they find a solution to come up with getting the job done.
Awesome. Thank you. So Rob, talk about, sort of what, from the Department of Transportation's perspective, were some of the important takeaways from the work of the task force. And then if you can, give us an update. The task force recommended this series of pilots to study different reduction strategies, to set a baseline of best practices, to explore more the use of brine, to look at maybe chloride-free zones, cold spots, these shaded areas that are particularly difficult to manage. So give us an update on the pilots, if you can, and sort of, what you thought was a key takeaway from the task force. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Some of the key takeaways for me were the need for closer management, the need for better training and better education, and also funding, to go back to AJ's point. Leading into the task force, we did a statewide rollout where we reached out to all the municipalities to talk about some of the challenges that they have, some of the challenges that we have, and just more of a practitioner level conversation. And what we found was equipment was a limiting factor in many locations, as far as the ability to put out prescribed rates of salt. And snow storage or salt storage was an issue in many locations. I think we've statewide we've probably come in better with that now. We have more control over that. But funding was an issue, and the training. I'm a believer that the training program that we have in DOT for our operators, for our supervisors, and for our managers, which are all different, I was a believer that it's some of the best in the country. And while I believe it's still very good, I think there's so much more room for continued management. Our operators, they believe that they're creating a safe environment out there. They know that they are. But what we need to do is show them through our training and through our education that when we reduce rates, we're not necessarily reducing safety. Our charge is to maintain the roads in a safe way, which we're doing that. But we just need to look for more creative ways of doing it by managing our salt use, reducing our salt use, through that training program. And also, Tim mentioned it in his presentation about the expectations. And I think there's an education component that also needs to be wrapped into this, that when we're getting a significant snowstorm, maybe we need to start thinking about our travel plans. Maybe it's not going to be practical to drive 65 miles an hour to the grocery store to pick something up. Maybe the grocery store trip can wait until tomorrow. It's those sort of travel demands that we do need to manage. And we need to continue the conversation. I've been with the department for 30 years. 10 and a half years of it were in maintenance. I started in Warren County, which we all know shares a portion of the Adirondack Park. It also shares a portion of the Lake George watershed. I've been in that job for probably less than 4 weeks. This guy over here stops in the office to talk to me, introduces himself, his role, his concerns about Lake George, and he started the conversation. And that conversation has been going on since then, right, Chris? Clearly, we have different charges, different goals, but we've always had respectful conversations. We've respectfully had differences of opinion at times, but we've maintained a respectful communication and coordination throughout this whole time, and it's going to continue. And I think that is imperative for continuing this conversation in a productive way. For the pilots, our plan for doing pilots heading into this season was, number one, to continue the pilots that we established for the last several years. We've got a pilot on 9N in Lake George, on 86 up in Lake Placid. We have what we call a direct liquids application beat, which puts down only liquids, no granular salt, in Herkimer County. So we're going to continue them. And then we also added another direct liquids application beat in Keysville on 9 and 9N because we wanted to do something within the Adirondack Park. So our goal is to continue these and to learn from them. What we're learning is the colder temperatures, as we suspected, the colder temperatures sometimes makes it a challenge to use a direct liquids application beat. So it's not always about getting wins with these. It's also about kind of identifying our boundaries. And we've identified some boundaries with direct liquids application, but we're invested in it. We're going to continue. What we've learned in Herkimer County, which granted it's not in the Adirondack Park, but we've learned that we can reduce our salt applications pretty significantly through that type of application. So there's going to be application for that type of treatment in many locations across the state. Speaking to no salt beats, you know, from a DOT standpoint, again, our charge is to maintain our roads in a safe manner. We believe that for the class of roadways that we have, higher speed, generally higher volume, we believe that road salt needs to be part of that equation. We believe certainly we need to manage it and use as little as possible, but we do believe road salt needs to be part of that equation. So from a no salt standpoint, we're not there yet, but we're certainly interested in being part of the conversation. We know some municipalities, some locations have tried it on lower volume types of roadways. I believe the ring road around Mirror Lake, it goes no salt, which is very successful, and we certainly encourage that, and we're interested in being part of that conversation. You know, we want to hear what you've learned. We want to hear what your challenges are. We want to hear what sort of changes to groundwater and to the surface waters you're seeing by doing these beats. Because again, we want to learn just as much as everyone else does.
Yeah, one of the last things still left over from that legislation that set up the task force is a report, I think, sort of on what the findings are from these pilots, and I think that's due in August, so we'll be keeping an eye out for that. Sawyer, we got Sawyer Bailey here next. Sawyer, you helped in the fall organize sort of some of the advocacy groups and other organizations in the park to write a letter to the governor and the state agencies, sort of calling for a long-term strategy, a multi-year plan, you know, ideas like an interagency council, staff people who can sort of be the czar of salt reduction. Talk about sort of, you know, why you thought that message was important and sort of what you think a long-term strategy might look like.
Sure, and hi everybody. It's so nice to be with you today. Thank you for coming out and talking about this with us. ADK Action has been working on road salt reduction since our founding in 2011, and anyone who's been working on an issue for over a decade knows that you try an awful lot of strategies and you look for windows of opportunity anywhere you can to make progress. We have amazing colleagues in the park who are also focused on road salt reduction for a variety of different purposes, and as we waited for the Road Salt Task Force report to come out, we were all thinking together, how do we be as strategic and collaborative as possible to make the most progress for our region? So when this long-awaited report came out over Labor Day, a long weekend, so we're back in the office after 3 days reading a long report, but immediately many of us said, okay, let's chat, because we need to come at this from different angles to create some progress together. So in order to answer that question of where do we go from here with the task force report, we realized that the task force was not going to necessarily be involved in the implementation side, so we needed to create some sort of supportive body for accountability to create the roadmap for implementation. So that was the first thing we really wrote in this letter to Governor Hochul's administration, who is building on success here. The governor had strong appointments to the task force and ushered in the release of this report. So in order to keep building on progress, we need agencies to come together and experts from across the state to come together to say, what's the game plan going to be for the rubber meeting the road on this work? Part of that, we believe, has to be the creation of staff positions to ensure that this kind of body can work together well, can be efficient, that what is discussed in those meetings can really come to fruition. Apart from that, to AJ's point, we really thought about the need for guardrails on how much chloride pollution is too much. New York is one of the only states in the Northeast that doesn't have a chloride threshold. So let's think, where do we start with that? There's language in the Road Salt Task Force report saying start with the Clean Water Act threshold and then work down from there based on where it makes sense across the state and here in the Adirondacks. And then from there, we need to be thinking about implementation. We're so thrilled to see the state making progress on the pilots. That feels like the most important thing to continue. But how do we begin charting a course for implementation on all the other great recommendations in the report? And then how do we scale that by 2030 to the whole rest of New York State? The Adirondacks are the canary in the coal mine on this issue, but really road salt pollution is an issue across the whole state. So how can we take all the innovations we're learning here and scale them? And then finally, how are we going to pay for it? We've already talked a lot about the resources needed for this. And of course, at the town and county level, it's hard enough to get funding to pave your roads well, let alone get the equipment that you need to really reduce salt with state-of-the-art technology. But at the state level, we see a lot of opportunity not to add to this budget deficit. It's going to be a difficult year for our budget, so we're trying to be really practical about this. We think there is opportunity with what might already show up on the road in terms of waste. Think about it, a lot of salt goes on the road, at least 2% of that salt is bouncing and scattering off. So if we take that 2% waste, reclassify what is ultimately millions and millions of dollars to allow that to fund some innovations at the state level, and then our towns and counties can do the very same thing. And of course, I want to hear what Tracy has to say about this, more expertise at the county level than I do, but I have to imagine that if we run our departments like a business and reinvest savings, we can make some progress with purchasing the tools we need to succeed. So we've been continuing to share all those tenets I just walked you through with this letter to try to see if we can make some progress at the Capitol in the legislative building. We have an awful lot of support for this with our local lawmakers, so we think there's opportunity.
You do see a lot of that in communities that are able to reduce this. They're reinvesting that money into new equipment and stuff. I know Mike's been doing that and others. So, Chris, Lake George is obviously a very well-resourced region and sort of jumped on this, a decade ago. Talk about the experience in Lake George when it comes to reducing salt use and sort of, what you thought was also important out of the task force going forward.
Great. Thank you, Zach, and thanks, Tracy, for putting this together. Thank you all for coming out. It's good to see some faces, familiar faces, and have meetings like this where it's not the virtual Zoom world is so much better. Again, I'm Chris Nowitzki, Lake George Waterkeeper, and we've worked on this issue actually going back to the 1980 when my parent organization, then the Fund for Lake George, had a partnership with Darren Freshwater Institute, started researching Lake George, and over the years we saw that the lake had actually tripled in chloride levels and much higher in our streams. So that was an issue, and we worked and developed what we thought an approach where we use it science to solutions, where we really start with the science and try to move towards solutions, and developed what we felt a model where we used partnership, innovation, and investment to address this issue. Started with partnership. We had a group, the Save Lake George Partnership, with elected officials, our supervisors, not-for-profits, as well as businesses. And we actually met to address invasive species, and we got the first mandatory inspection program on Lake George. And while we were at the table, we said, why don't we take a look at another big issue, road salt? And there was consensus, and we actually started with an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, where all the municipalities around the lake agreed to work towards this issue. It wasn't a binding agreement, contract. There was no financial commitment. We just said, we want to meet, we want to talk about this, we want to see what ideas are out there, we want to bring the technology in to help our hardworking highway departments. We want to try to seek funding, get the answers, bring the experts in, and we also agreed to start hosting an annual SALT Summit. Innovation. I'm an engineer, but I'm by no means an expert on road salt reduction back then. I'm still not, I'm still learning. But let's bring in the experts, the innovation. Let's bring in the better equipment. We developed a partnership with, introduced the live edge plows and developed a partnership with them where we actually became a kind of wholesale dealer and worked with people like Rob Thlopoulos and who wound up being the leaders. We brought in the experts who brought the best practices in, talked about measuring and calibrating and preventing and improving and analyzing and ultimately optimizing to reduce the road salt. And we also thought of investing. We wanted to put our money where our mouth is. Again, provided grants for equipment to make it easier for our operators. We contracted with a consultant. We brought in that firm to really bring the training and expertise and the data management so that they could start making decisions based on data. As we like to do with science, let's bring that to another level and allow our operators to have that same opportunity. And lastly, we've actually recently partnered with and invested with the town of Lake George to try to develop a brine co-op, to take this to another aspect where we've got to start addressing it on a private level. That's another problem. It's the states, it's the locals, but it's also the privates. So really, we've got to hit all factors on that. So with that, with the partnership, the Save Lake George partnership, as Rob mentioned, Rob Fitch, we met with DOT, talked about what we were seeing, talked about the science, and they initiated the pilot reduction program on Route 9N in Lake George. We've also invested in monitoring that to see how the best practices are doing, see what is transpiring and actually carrying over to the water quality, where we actually continuously monitor the streams. And we just released a 4-year study, the first 4 years of that, and there are varying findings that we had. We see good aspects, we see some aspects that there can be improvements. So with that, and with the task force, I think that there's a couple things that we really need to focus on. I'm excited to see and completely support the pilot programs that are out there and thank DOT for that. I am hoping that we can start hosting the strategic working groups that we used to have with, we had Adirondack Road Salt Working Group with DOT, with DEC, with elected officials, with the not-for-profits, and that we would meet and talk about these points and these concerns of ours and raise them with DOT. They would talk about how they're moving to address these. I think we need to reinitiate those. The public reach out, I think, is very important. Echo and completely support what Rob said. This is an issue that we're all involved in, not just the operators, but we as the users need to reduce our expectations and increase what we do to also address this issue. And as Sawyer said, the funding is going to be big. We are now into budget season, and we need to raise these issues up. The letter that those folks supported and sent down to the governor, that needs to be heard. We all need to echo that and raise these important issues to help people like Tracy, who talks a lot about infrastructure and things like paving. We need to get projects like that funded, which actually help keep our roads clean and clear. And so we're all in this together. Thanks.
Thank you. Tracy, as someone who actually puts in an order for salt every year, I mean, talk about what you guys are doing in Hamilton County and sort of what do you think is needed? You know, these best practices are pretty well known. There's pretty good awareness. You can go and find out what do we need to sort of get those expanded and implemented more broadly. What's needed?
Well, thank you for having us today. This is an important topic. I've been the Public Works Superintendent for Hamilton County for in a couple of months, it'll be 20 years. I am a lifelong resident within the Blue Line, so it is important. I see what it does to our infrastructure, as Chris just mentioned. I'm common sense. I will say Hamilton County's highway system, the county system and the town system, obviously we're very rural. We don't typically use, we are not 100% salt use county as far as our county system. We typically use a sand salt mix. Our salt usage has gone up here the last few years just because of the temperature change and weather patterns with freezing rain. Unfortunately, that drives that up. So, you know, we also contract with DOT for over 100 lane miles within the county. You know, listening to everybody talk, and as I was on the task force, the task force was frustrating, and what I mean by that was There was 12 of us, I believe, on the task force, plus people from DEC, Department of Health, DOT, that were super helpful. And it was because we were all passionate. We all had some expertise, and it was to learn from each other how important the other part was, and a common sense approach. And really what I learned from that was this really is a societal problem that we started 40 years ago, that we expect whenever we go, no matter what time of day it is, we're going to travel 65 miles an hour no matter what. We can't have that expectation anymore. The pressure that a practitioner like myself, or highway superintendents, or town highway workers, DOT, I was telling Chris and a little story before. We had an accident on one of our county roads this winter. Van went through a turn. We were plowing and went through the turn, broadsided our truck. Myself and my highway manager got to the scene, and the driver of the vehicle said, "Boy, it's slippery out here." Really? That's why we're out there. You know, that's the kind of attitude. Slow down. That tort lawsuits, the pressure on, if anybody here that lives in government that is responsible for plowing highways gets both calls. Why aren't you out there? Why aren't you out there when I'm out there? Or you're out there too much. You know, as some have said, you know, this working. The first thing I learned in the task force is, you know, with everybody was, most small towns and counties don't even have, they really don't know what they even want to do with snow and ice control. You've got to begin someplace. You got to figure out, what are you going to do? What are we doing here? We want to remove snow, sure, but how? An example is Hamilton County. My operational plan is we're basically, we plow our roads from 5:30 to 10:30 at night. If it's not freezing rain or something, it's basically dark hours. I understand, you know, freezing rain and that kind of thing, all bets are off. But we've got to have a common sense approach. But we also have the pressure of law enforcement calling us out when, I'm not sure if I need to do that. It's as Rob said, our main charge is to provide a reasonably safe road for the reasonably safe driver. Pretty broad, but that's our charge. And most of the time we lose out on that. It's if we're, you know, so it's frustrating. So it's an education, broad education. I don't like using salt on the roads. I see what it does to our equipment, our bridges, our roads. I see that, but not everybody does. And this kind of thing, as frustrating as it may be, and people want action, it's going to take. If this is a big problem, it's coming to light. We're going in the right direction. As Chris said, I have several of the task force members know that I have pushed the whole time for, you know, we need to cut the canopies back. And some of the people on the phone, no, we can't do it. I'm not asking to cut the forest. Let natural lights come in, pave some roads. Just take a squeegee in your garage floor. If it's a smooth surface, it cleans right off. If it's rough and cracky, it don't work so good. We can reduce salt a lot just by that, a lot. You know, I'm hoping that the governor. I was disappointed the governor didn't use some of the bond act for paving some of the roads in the Adirondacks. In that kind of stuff. Money's an issue. These small departments with live edge, we've started putting live edge blades on all our equipment in Hamilton County, equipping them with Dickie Johns, which are computer-controlled spreaders, so we know a lot of these small towns cannot afford it without some kind of subsidy. And they need an operational plan. And they have to understand, they don't have to reinvent the wheel here. There's a lot of this stuff out here. There's information out there to help. I am all for improving, trying to learn from our past mistakes and open ears. And as someone said, anybody in here who works in a highway department, as the gentleman down there said, when you have someone that's worked for 35 years and you come in and say, you're not doing it right, or we're going to do it different, it's tough. It's a tough sell sometimes. It's a slow process. I'm always learning, but I do care. I think we do need to do it, but it's a global effort. So I don't know if I answered your question, Zach. I kind of went all over the place.
No,
That's me though.
That was a good answer. Thank you. Yeah. If any of you are ever bored, you can go to the State Court of Claims, and I think there's a search function on there, and you can Google salt, and you can read all about these ice-related torts that we hear so much about. They're pretty interesting. Brendan, so AJ started us off by talking about these rising chloride concentrations that we're picking up across the state. There's been, there's an AWI, number of other programs and organizations that closely monitor the water quality of lakes throughout the park. So talk about what we're seeing in terms of some of the most highly impacted, lakes when it comes to salt pollution in this region, and some of the, ecosystem effects that we're learning about.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Zach, and thanks everyone for coming out today. As I was thinking about sitting on this panel, it occurred to me that I'm the third generation of scientists at AWI that's worked on this particular issue. Our organization goes back about 30 years, and one of the very first reports that we put out was looking at the Adirondack Lake survey data that was done in the mid-90s, looking at about 1,500 lakes across the park. And our then executive director, Michael Martin, produced a map of the chloride concentrations across the Adirondacks, and it was pretty clear that there were elevated concentrations in association with state roads in our communities. And so we're still sort of working through this problem today. And what we've seen at AWI is this association with, particularly with state roads, and not to pick on the state, but as Rob said, they sort of have a difficult job of maintaining major highways between communities where people are traveling at high rates of speed. And so, by that very nature, we would expect that they're going to have to apply more material on their roads than necessarily is going to be applied on our local roads. And in terms of the lakes that we see that are most impacted, Lake Colby in the village of Saranac Lake has particularly high concentrations. The Cascade Lakes along 73 are quite high. And then Mirror Lake in the village of Lake Placid. And Mirror Lake is really unique in the Adirondacks because it's really an urban lake. 27% of the land cover around Mirror Lake is developed. That's a really high proportion for a lake here in the Adirondacks. And it also has a lot of different types of road and surfaces around it as well. So there's a little less than a mile of state road. I think there's maybe 11 miles of town and village road. And then for anyone that's been in Lake Placid and looked around, there's dozens of parking lots, sidewalks, driveways, and other types of surfaces that are receiving an application of salt during the winter time. And a few years ago, working in partnership with the Ausable River Association, we discovered that Mirror Lake was exhibiting a phenomenon that is quite rare for lakes that are impacted by salt, which is the salt was coming in at such high concentrations through the stormwater system, and it really at concentrations similar to seawater were coming out of the pipes around Mirror Lake and going into the lake. And that's high enough that the salt water coming out of those pipes was just flowing along the bottom of the lake and accumulating at the lake bottom. And so we could see this in real time. As a scientist, it was really fun, but bad as well, where we could go out on the lake the day after this first application of salt around the lake, look at the entire profile of the lake, and see the salt at the bottom of the lake that was put down the day before. And then all winter long, as our staff were going out there and doing this, you can literally just see the numbers marching higher and higher and higher throughout the winter time. And the result of that is we would have two layers of water in Mirror Lake, one at the surface that had high concentrations of salt, and then one at the bottom that had even higher concentrations of salt, hundreds of times higher than what we would expect to see in an Adirondack lake. And the impact of that on Mirror Lake was that those two layers didn't want to mix together because they were of different density. The analogy that I like to use and I think is relatable to everyone, is it's like Italian salad dressing. When you pull it out of the fridge, you have the oil and vinegar. Unless you're sort of a weird person, you probably want to mix that up before you put it on your salad, and you have to put energy into that system, into that bottle, by vigorously shaking it to do that. And then the same thing was happening in Mirror Lake, where more energy was required to mix the lake, and so the water at the bottom was trapped down there, basically. It would lose oxygen. That was bad for the fish. There's a whole host of repercussions as a result of this. And the lake would turn over in the fall, but the next winter it would all start back over again. And so I think there has been a lot of successes with Lake George around their salt reduction efforts, but there's been a lot of success in Lake Placid as well as a result of the pilot efforts that DOT has put in place around there, and then the work of the town and village, where we've seen the salt concentrations come down in Mirror Lake. The lake is back to mixing the way it should. The town and village have invested in the state millions of dollars in redesigning infrastructure and stormwater systems. They've changed their practices on their sidewalks, and all of these things have resulted in Mirror Lake returning to its normal mixing regime. And now every year when I go out there, I get excited because almost every time that we go out on the lake, or our staff do, and they come back, I look at the data and the numbers are just continuing to go down. And so I think that's, lessons that we can learn there and from Lake George, and is a positive story associated with salt. And then the last, I guess, one thing I just want to quickly mention too is AWI has been looking at this issue as part of the Adirondack Lake Assessment Program, which is a partnership with Protect the Adirondacks. It's a community science program that was started in 1998, and I was just looking at the very first reports that came out from that program, and chloride was one of the things that we were measuring when that program started. And it was really rare at that time for a monitoring program to be looking at salt. And we've been monitoring it since then, and that data has been really integral to our understanding of this issue within the Adirondacks more broadly. A lot of that data was in different ways incorporated in the task force report. And some of that data and some of our other work, and Chris sort of touched on this a little bit as well, led us to start understanding that there was potentially groundwater contamination as a result of the salt application in the park. We were seeing high concentrations in streams months after the winter season had ended. And a number of years ago, we tested over 500 public wells across the region and found that there is also widespread groundwater salinization as a result of this problem. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. This isn't just an ecological problem. This is an issue that affects some number of people's human health, their livelihoods. They're replacing appliances and other things as a result of not having access to clean drinking water. And so I think that's something that we're definitely going to be continuing to look at AWI moving forward.
Yeah, I think an important note, and Chris's monitoring work on Lake George showed this, is that the salt we put down 20 years ago, some of it might have gotten right into the water and gone into one of these lakes. Some of it might have gotten into the soil and is slowly migrating. So we're still dealing with this legacy of our salt use that is, even if we stopped today, we'd still be seeing concentrations increasing in some of these bodies of water possibly. I don't know, maybe the scientists can correct me on that, but anyway, so I do want to circle back as a group here, and whoever wants to jump in can jump in now, to this long-term strategy question. There was some discussion, I know, at the task force about having like an advisory committee that could sort of oversee or provide advice into the sort of implementation of these recommendations, and that wasn't included ultimately. And some of these groups are calling for this idea of an interagency council where representatives from DOT and DEC and maybe DO8, the Department of Health, other agencies would meet in some kind of formalized structure to talk about how this process is going, to come together as agencies, and to facilitate this conversation about, moving forward on these recommendations. So I haven't heard anything about whether or not that's on the table yet, but I'm curious from everyone sort of, what a long-term approach to really ensure that isn't just sort of left up to sort of, various groups to sort of do this on their own, but to really move this ball forward and to have accountability mechanisms to ensure that there is progress. So you guys have 2 microphones. You can share. Whoever wants to jump in, please feel free.
Well, maybe I can start by acknowledging that we faced a similar wicked problem. And when I say a wicked, I mean really challenging because it hits at all different areas of public life, economy, social, environmental. And that's invasive species management. It's an issue we're still at work on today, but the way we've made a lot of progress on this is through an interagency council, moving through different agency personnel and different experts across the state coming together, working as an interagency group, to your point about working groups, to solve a really hard challenge and make sure that the implementation is coordinated. So we're trying to take a page out of that book and learn from resources that are working and apply them to different problems like road salt reduction. So I don't know if anyone else wants to add more to that.
Yeah, I can't really comment on the aspect of a multi-agency approach. It's certainly above my purview. But again, we're always interested in being part of the conversation, to sharing what we've learned, to sharing our challenges. Because we've had similar successes on the practitioner level, working with municipalities, learning from one another. And really the biggest thing we're focusing on right now is putting together the framework for the report that we're going to be putting together, as required by the legislation. So at the end of the summer, we're looking forward to producing this report that shows what we've learned through these pilot programs. And I think that'll really be a good springboard for us to really continue that conversation.
We'll come back to you, AJ.
I'm two-fisted. That's the first time ever. Thanks, Rob. I think the one thing that I would like to bring up, and I think it was as a task force member, I'd like to echo what Tracy said, and I will qualify it a bit because you guys did a lot of the work on it, and I was brought on late in the game. I was a later appointee, and I appreciate all the hard work that you guys did, and then I got my name in it, so it was really nice. But after the report came out, I felt, I can't talk for everyone, I felt there was a little too much silence on for me to take. I felt that came out, Sawyer said it came out, it's not as good when something comes out on a Friday afternoon, especially on a long weekend. You forget about it, and then come the next week, it's already old news. So I felt we should have taken, that momentum that came out with that study, hoping that there'd be kind of an action plan and a rollout that we'd start to prioritize things. Fortunately, in my view, that didn't happen as quickly as I would like. We were hoping, we wanted to use the SALT Summit to kind of use that as an opportunity to say these are things to point to and move forward. So to move towards that accountability, I would still like to see kind of, and I'll lean on the co-chairs, DOT, DEC, to kind of set some priorities in what we can achieve, in that first year. Right now it's budget season. Can we start moving some of these things and get them in the discussion to start funding? I think one of the biggest things I felt should have been addressed is training. We need to help these operators, and we need to help at the town levels too, but I think grants should be tied to training because education is so much a part of that. So I was hoping we'd get a bit more of an action plan, a bit more of a rollout, and that we could elevate that, and maybe we still can, and especially now during the budget season. So.
Anyone else? AJ, do you want to add anything?
So I think, again, thanks for having us here. I think it's really great because it shows that there is still momentum moving after the task force report came out. So I do want to make sure that, you know, from DEC, and I think also probably DOT would second this, that we do have quite a bit of momentum going, right, coming out of the task force, and that there are things that we're doing to try and move the needle forward on the recommendations. And I think, you know, if we're always willing, you know, to engage on whatever the next phase of things would be, you know, if the governor or the legislature were to, you know, ask us to come together in some way, we would, you know, we would be at the table. We believe it's an important subject, just as we took the task force report and the engagement with the task force very seriously. We take this, what we're doing now and how we're moving forward, equally as seriously. And you know, so just on a couple of those things, some of the stuff that we're doing now, I mentioned it before, you know, funding is a big issue, right? And we heard that, and we want to try and make funding available wherever possible so that the best management practices that are recommended could actually start to get implemented on the ground. And I think maybe it was Bailey had mentioned that, you know, what can we do within existing budgets is an important question to ask. And I think that that's something that we are doing. We're reviewing the funding streams that are available to us now and looking at the grant opportunities that we have. Like, so we use our Water Quality Improvement Projects grant, which is a huge grant as part of the consolidated funding application that municipalities have availability to every year, to see if there are ways that we can use existing budgets to fund new project types under our Water Quality Improvement Program, to be able to do things like, you know, fund brine facilities, right? Additional types of salt storage facilities. Maybe it is funding equipment for trucks and things like that. You know, that's all under review currently, stuff that we're doing right now. The water quality standards piece, as I mentioned before, is huge for us. And the chloride, update of the chloride standard is an important element that we're looking at as part of what we call our triennial water quality standards review. So every state under the Clean Water Act, every 3 years, right? Comes and goes, right? We try to do it on every 3 years, but there's a lot going on. So we have to look at our water quality standards on a regular basis and review those that need to be updated. And so right now, and hopefully in the next few months, there'll be, you'll see an opportunity for public involvement, public input on our triennial water quality standards review and what water quality standards we're actually looking at updating as part of that set of rulemakings that we'll eventually have to do. And so, you know, that's going to be a great opportunity for us to really engage on the recommendation there in terms of water quality standards, and then also other types of regulatory thresholds that might help protect and kind of set the bar for a lot of other programs that we have at DEC relative to water quality itself, both surface and groundwater. And then on the training side, I think it connects back to our approach on funding. We can't really move forward on funding unless we can guarantee that the money we're providing is going to folks that know what to do with the money, right? To implement the best management practices in the way that they need to be implemented. And so we need to make sure that there's training that's happening. You know, the kinds of stuff that you guys were talking about before. And so DEC, we don't really have the expertise on training. So that's like great opportunity for us to partner with, you know, DOT and other groups on getting training and outreach going, so that then it can connect well with whatever funding opportunities we might be able to provide.
Thank you. Rob mentioned that there was this event yesterday at the Peru Garage where some local highway departments were working together to talk through sort of what they're, you know, doing and how that's going and some of the challenges that they're facing. And it was really interesting to me. I got there a few minutes late, and within 5 minutes, they're talking about, you know, that they can't source a certain type solar salt, which is what they want to use for their brine, because the companies that sell that aren't bidding up this way, and they're talking about since they can't get that, it's a lot messier of a process to make this brine, and they're spending hours sometimes cleaning out their brine makers, and it really shows you that going down this path of trying to optimize your salt use and implement these best practices can get messy at times. So I'm curious to talk more about what those departments, the people on the ground, really can use. There's a lot of interesting sort of tracking that collects data about road temperatures and air temperature and how much is being used, and they can go back to that and analyze their approach to different storms. So I don't know if Rob Vopoulos and anyone else wants to sort of talk about what are these sort of tools that are being used and that could help, if there were more of them, expand these best practices.
Well, definitely the tracking is a huge thing. So knowing, the where, the when, and the how to put down material, that's huge. Having these decision-making tools is huge. The equipment that we viewed yesterday, they not only know where their trucks went, they have pictures going down the road through dash cams. A lot of times they even have pictures of the salt coming out of the truck to verify the salt is coming out of the truck. With that, they also can do temperature. They can map temperature as they go down the road. So if there was ever a complaint, or they could actually say, yes, we know we went by this spot at X time, we put this amount of material down, we have pictures to confirm that we did it, and yes, we know it was a cold spot because we have verification, because we have temperature sensors that relay this information. Other equipment would be like live edge plows, which a lot of these places are using now. The more material you remove, the less material you have to put back on the road to bring it back to a safe friction level. And then using the best piece of equipment really for the particular job you're doing is huge. A lot of these guys, they know their routes. They know what they need to do to get the job done. So with training and the right equipment used correctly, we can achieve lower numbers.
I'm going to try and repeat what you just said, because it's much the same. It's about, for us, it's about applying the right amount of the right material at the right time. So we need to have good awareness as far as what the conditions are out there, what the future conditions are going to be, but also better awareness about our equipment. DOT, we've got a little over 1,600 plow trucks statewide, and historically we've had GPS on all of them. So we know where they are, and we know how fast they're going. It's helpful, but going into this season, we put on what we call an enhanced GPS system, where we now can look at the telemetry of the material coming out the back. So now we can track our salt usage, our granular salt usage, as well as our liquid brine usage. So we know how much we're using, where we're using it, when we're using it. We've also coupled that with forward-facing cameras. So now we can see the conditions on the road when we're applying it. So that gives our managers and our supervisors that extra level of awareness to really see what the conditions are as we're applying it. Do we need to be applying it? And then secondarily, the next time that truck might come around, we can see the impacts of that previous treatment that they did. So it's this additional awareness, this additional supervision, and really that's where I see our training program really needs to focus now on that management aspect of it. We hear of some locations doing substantial reductions in application rates. From a practitioner standpoint, I think DOT's application rates are pretty good, but I think there's a lot of management that can be done. Making sure we are putting down material when we need to. If the weather's in our favor, if the road temperatures are coming up, if the sun is coming out on a day like this, it gives us an opportunity to start thinking about, do we need to do this application? And as part of that training, we need to be encouraging more our operators to have that communication. As far as the technology, we really need to encourage that communication. Talking to a few folks here earlier today, we all know that success breeds success, and it's contagious. We've seen that with our own pilot beats. We've started, the pilot beat that we do on 9N in Lake George. There might be a little skepticism when we start it. The shop that's doing that beat now, that pilot beat, they are bought into salt management. They're still dedicated to providing a safe road. You tell them to provide a road that's unsafe, they're not going to do it. They want to provide a safe road, but they know they can do it through salt management. And it's spread, it's contagious within that shop now, because the other beat that shop does, they're doing very similar things there now as well, because we want to breed upon that success. And there's a lot of creative things that we do out in our shops, whether it's at the municipal level or the state level. We need to have better communication among ourselves so we can share those good things. Because, yeah, there's struggles with brine makers. Some brine makers are better than others because they can't handle that sludge that's created when we create brine. There's ways of getting solar salt, maybe if you buy it by the tote instead of buying it by the truckload. There's different things that can be done, different ways of plumbing a truck for applying brine. We are very creative out there, but we are not very good communicators. We tend to keep these secrets to ourselves. And this is shareware. This has to be public information that we need to share with everybody. When one town does something really great, every town should have that opportunity of kind of compounding on top of that, because we all benefit.
Awesome. I will note that one of the recommendations in the report was about, sort of this data transparency and sort of over time finding a way to get some of that cool data that they're collecting on their trucks out into a public setting. So I got a lot more here that I wanted to get into, but I know we're running short on time, and I promised questions, so we're going to definitely get to that. As a former education reporter, I'm going to give priority to the Long Lake kids with the first question, so I hope they're ready for that. Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know if one of you guys have a question. They told me they had one, so.
Have you considered using pepper instead of salt?
Okay. Yeah, okay. I don't know. I think probably not, if I had to guess. So in the back here.
All options are on.
There you go. It's actually interesting. Beet juice is, you hear when you do this research, there's a lot of beet juice. I spoke to a woman in Wisconsin who's very involved in this, and they used leftover cheese brine as an option. Apparently it didn't scale. I don't know, but go ahead,
If
gentleman
I
in
could,
the back.
Zach, just quickly, I mean, alternatives are good. Our partnership with the Jefferson Project down in Lake George, we actually studied some of the alternatives that were brought up, beet juice, byproducts from fermentation and breweries. One of the big concerns with the beet juice was the addition of sugars to the environment. As that runs off, that leads to, again, oxygen depletion, because it takes the bacteria to break down the sugars and takes the oxygen away. But alternatives are important and things to consider.
Yeah, and every alternative has an alternative, impact to the environment. So,
Zach, if I could ask on the education side of it, I'm curious, is salt use being discussed in the schools? For instance, we talk about STEM a lot, getting folks into science and technology. Are there any class projects about salt use? Is anybody doing any experiment creating brine to see how we can do our driveways and reduce our reliance on granular material? I mean, I think just starting that conversation early will be a big help at just kind of planting that seed with everyone that salt management is important.
yeah, and I know there are some examples of that, and I think it's a really interesting, great local sort of issue to engage students in, so hopefully we continue to see more of that. The gentleman in the back here with the American flag hat.
I'm John Eldridge. I live in Lake Placid, actually town of North Elba. I'm aware of the pilot program between Lake Placid and Wilmington. For the last 2 years anyway, the speed limit had been 45 during the winter. It's now back to 55. I'd like to know why.
That pilot had two components to it. We had a reduced salt management component, but then we also had a smaller segment within there that was exploring the use of abrasives, basically lower salt, the use of sand and sand-salt mixes to provide snow and ice. So as part of that, because we were concerned that we were going to be reducing the level of service by going with a sand-salt mix, we put in that reduced speed limit from a safety perspective. But over the course of, I believe, 2 seasons, we learned that those abrasive mixes weren't going to work for us. So we curtailed use of the abrasive mix. We're still doing the pilot, but we just pulled out that sand-salt mix, and because of that, we eliminated that seasonal speed limit.
I suggest you take the signs down. Some of them are reading 45, some are reading 55.
Yeah, they shouldn't be, so we can look at that.
This woman here in the front.
You talking 9P around the lake? Yeah. Yeah. No, the DOT believes, and I can't speak for municipalities, but we believe that road salt, pure road salt, is the proper material to be using for anti-icing. We rarely use sand salt mixes. You know, if we're in a freezing rain situation or extremely low temperatures, there's a place for that. But generally speaking, we're using just road salt. Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought that up. What those stripes are? Those are pinstripe prides. We sometimes refer to them. That's a brine that we put down before the storm. That's pre-storm anti-icing. So we put down salt brine at a much lower application rate. The water dissipates. It leaves that little bit of salt behind. But what that does is that allows the brine layer to reform on the road surface once the precipitation starts. And that brine layer is really what we want, because we want to prevent the forming of ice and hardpack on the pavement surface. So that's what's going on there. And because you're seeing it, I'm happy to hear that, because that's what we want them doing out there.
And thanks for coming all the way from Saratoga. And I think it's important to note that this is obviously an issue that affects the whole state, really the whole, northern half of the country. And so it's not just our Adirondack lakes that are being impacted.
So I just, abrasives are also something that we talked about during the task force, and I think that from an environmental perspective, right, and especially from an aquatic habitat perspective, an abrasive can come with its own issues, especially once that abrasive washes off, just like chloride, into a nearby surface water, and the impacts that it can have on basic aquatic habitats is an important thing to be considering when talking about the application of an abrasive. So, if you have a benefit by using a brine solution that gives you less chloride use, but doesn't carry with it additional impacts, that that could be a positive, right, as opposed to using an abrasive. But again, I guess I always think about the different types of solutions being dependent on the area and the application, right, and where and what the concerns might actually be, especially when it comes to like an aquatic habitat concern.
I think we're going to go here to this in the front here. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Marie McMahon. We own a business in Lake Placid. We offer short-term rental caretaking, landscaping, and of course winter maintenance. And knowing that what we were doing in the winter was affecting the environment especially, and we were literally seeing the effects in some of the HOAs, the salt in the winter, and then problems with the landscape in the summer, we just decided we've got to pull the plug on this. And we literally are in the process of doing that thanks to Rob and some 80K action. Chris, I am really curious. So you're doing this great work in Lake George, but are there private companies involved? The property owners around I almost said Lake Placid, the property owners around Lake George, are they participating? How is it trickling down, or has it not trickled down yet? We caretake for a lot of properties on Mirror Lake, and we are literally, starting next year, we're going chloride free, and we're not giving anybody an opportunity to say, no, we're just going to say, this is what we need to do, and this is why. And we're very much involved with ADK Action in terms of the education, et cetera. But I'm just wondering if there's some of the same efforts in Lake George.
Thank you. And Chris, before you jump in, I'll say that another thing in the report was this, there's a program in New Hampshire where if private contractors who do this type of winter management go through certain training, get certified, report their salt use back to the state, then they get some, there's a limit to the liability, basically, that they have as long as they're not negligent in their practice. They can't be sued, or the properties that they're working for can't be sued if someone has an accident. Go ahead, Chris.
First, thank you for your work, and I'd love to have you as a spokesperson to come down. We are not at that level that we'd like to be right now. Through our organization, we've attempted a few ways. We've actually tried to provide grants to private contractors to get them to take that leap of faith, as our highway departments had to, working with our consultant, actually, with advisors, trying to use them as a consultant, as a resource. We've developed a new initiative, a Lake Protector program, so that we actually register property owners and give them information on their property that influence runoff, tree cover, impervious cover, and whatnot. So through that, we're trying to educate them as well. And I mentioned earlier the brine co-op that we set up with the town of Lake George, just to offer that to contractors that take care of the private properties. And we're not where we'd like to be, but these are some of the measures we're trying to do to reach that point.
So did you want to add anything about sort of trying to reach these other audiences that aren't, the municipal and state and government users?
Definitely, and we've been really lucky to learn from Chris's work and the work of the Lake George Association. We realized that they were creating a model in Lake George, and it's something that we could scale to the entire Adirondack Park. So the reason we're so lucky to work with Marie and with the town of Peru and with 23 other towns and counties across the Adirondacks is because we're working with them on best management practice training. Also through Rob and Phil, their company WIT advisors, to bring the best in the business technical expertise to our motivated highway departments. Even while we waited for this report and for action at the state level, we realized there was a window of opportunity here with our towns. But in order to really serve our private contractors, who at the end of the day have to do what their clients ask of them, we realized we need to be communicating with the driving public. And I think this gets to what we're all saying about expectations. You'll see it out in the atrium, our public outreach campaign called Don't Be Salty. We're taking a lot of heavy science information and making it approachable and fun to help people understand the impacts of road salt pollution, and also what action we can all take, be it at your private residence or whatever area that you work with, your neighborhood, your watershed association, to help everyone make progress on this. So we're looking to scale that across the park too, and across the state for that matter. We have a lot more work to do with private contractors, but Marie and Wes are leading the way.
Here, this gentleman here.
Yes, I'm Dean Bianco. What, if anything, what has been learned from, if anything, from neighboring states, their approaches? Has that been researched? Has it been synthesized? I'd like to know about that.
Thank you. Yeah. Anyone?
Yeah, there is a national consortium of departments of transportation called Clear Roads. I think there's 38 member states right now, most of the Northeast, Midwest, western part of the country. DOT is part of that, and part of that consortium is to share information, learn best practices, and to fund research projects. So, in fact, DOT championed a project, I think 2 years ago now, to talk about environmental sensitivity with salt use. So we championed and we've piloted. I think we're in beta testing right now for this GIS application that can be filled with all sorts of items that are of environmental sensitivity, whether it's wetlands, certain endangered species, public drinking water wells, private wells, all sorts of things. And by using them, you can create a sensitivity along a certain segment of road for road salt. And what we think we can use that for is practitioners that have limited resources can identify those beats that are most sensitive within their area of responsibility and focus their better resources in those areas, whether it be that one truck that they can buy that's got the telemetry on it, or maybe it's their more seasoned operator, maybe it's that one live edge plow they can buy, whatever that might be. Or maybe it's just raised awareness. Maybe that's where we do our reduced salt application if we want to experiment with it. Or maybe that's where our one brine truck can do its work. But it's a way to identify that, that sensitivity and be cognizant of it. But as far as just the general information sharing, there's always information that's going back and forth. We're looking to learn from one another. We're also doing another research project on winter severity. So we can start gauging our snow and ice response based on the winter severity. Now, there are winter severity tools out there, but they're not really developed from a road practitioner standpoint, from a snow and ice practitioner standpoint. They're based on other things like, ground snow cover and some temperature things that don't really apply to us. So, but we're working on that so we can better benchmark our work. So, but that's an excellent question.
So we're at AWI, we're in the midst of 2 research projects to help us understand more on a watershed scale, different practices across the Lake Champlain Basin, which has the advantage of half of it roughly is in Vermont and the other half is in New York. And so we're looking at tributary data coming out into the lake between New York and Vermont to see if there are any major fundamental differences between the loading that's occurring in Vermont versus New York, and if there are, what lessons could we learn as a result of that? On a more fine scale, we have another project. Michaela Lahote, who's in the audience over here, one of our grad students, is combining chloride data from lakes across the basin to look at the individual salt loading to these lakes across the Lake Champlain Basin, which spans 2 states, many counties, and municipalities, to see if we can find patterns across that basin where there are locations with a similar amount of road and other landscape characteristics, but have less salt loading, so we can identify those places that are, maybe doing a really good job in their salt application, that we can then find them and uncover their stories and help share that information out, across both within a state, but between states to help us learn, sort of as a community around this.
Yep. Sorry, Hildegard, did you have a question?
Yeah. So I'm wondering how we take the truck operators out of the hot seat and turn our attention to landside civil engineering. It seems as though managing the highway right-of-ways might be a valuable tool in managing the entry of road salt into groundwater. One of the possible solutions that I've been personally experimenting with my front yard is in planting salt-tolerant plants that I get from Niasdeck Nursery. How can we bring the solutions that Lake Placid has generated out into our rural communities? That's number one question. Number two, the public health issue is very, very important. And many of our year-round residents live along highly treated major roadways. Adirondack Park skews old. When we look at the kind of long-term diseases that our population suffers from, I think it would be valuable to consider the impact of salt on well water. One particular constituent that hangs in my mind, because my manganese concentration in my well water is at the drinking water maxima, is that salt in water mobilizes other contaminants. Manganese contamination manganese poisoning looks like Parkinson's. It's important.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that she asked that. This is the public health. A part of this is very critical, and one of the questions I did want to ask was about one of the recommendations is this idea of this called rapid response, and this idea of how do we do a better job of making sure that people whose wells are impacted, A, know it, and B, have something that they can go to get help with that problem, and something that's more structured, more formal from them, so that there isn't sort of a passing of the buck that they feel. So I don't know who wants to speak to the public health part of this, and the design sort of element is also interesting.
Well, being an engineer, I will take the easier question, which is the one about site design, which I think gets back to something Maria was here earlier about, and that's something we actually are contemplating for a session for this year's SALT Summit, is how we can bring that design aspect into the layout of individual properties or developments in general. Obviously, salt-tolerant plants is an important way. Addressing drainage off of our roadways, directing those into areas and infiltration. One of the biggest concerns about fluorides is that it's conservative, and when we say conservative, it does not bind with anything. Once it's in the soils and in our groundwater, it's there. It's not like the sodium, which when it dissipates from sodium and chloride, sodium will actually bind to the soil particles, which then release the other metals with the soils, calcium, manganese, potassium, the aluminum, and cause the other problems. But I think that that's an important thing that we want to, we're actually doing some research and seeing who we can bring to this year's SALT Summit to address that and bring that and raise that to people's minds when they're going through that design process. So that's the easier part, I think. I think Sawyer is going to...
My best, but for those of you who don't know, there's something called slow violence. The idea that things diminish so slowly in our environment that we don't notice them, but ultimately they cause deep harm to the people who are least able to bear it. That's an environmental justice issue. The idea that those who are elders in our community have to bear the burdens of water they can't drink at their home, on their real property that they own, that if they resell, and they talk about the fact that this property has water pollution, that's their asset that's diminished. That's their health that's diminished. That's their time. I know too many people who have to drive to a spring on the side of a small road and fill up gallon jugs and bring them home. I used to live in a house that had manganese pollution in the water, and that's what I did because I couldn't afford having Culligan drop off water for me. It is so difficult for our neighbors who are faced with this solution, losing their livelihoods, their farms. It's one person having to deal with this is too many. So those rapid response recommendations in the task force report are just as essential as what we're talking about at the highway garage and at the Capitol building. It matters for our community's viability moving forward. I think it's no big thing to ask to say that if you suspect your well water is contaminated by road salt because you live near an uncovered salt pile or you live in proximity to a state road, you should have a clear sense of what your due diligence process is. You should be able to go on a web page and see, okay, this is the agencies I talk with, this is how I request a test kit, and this is who's going to help me along the way. This is a statute of limitations, and if it's found that there is pollution, this is what's going to happen. Because we have seen a variety of responses when pollution is found, and not many of us have the time or money to bear an extended lawsuit. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and really, we're not here to point fingers at what may have happened over the past decade. We're here for pragmatism and solutions. So we think the creation of a no-fault fund, which is called out in the task force report, is the best way for us to navigate existing pollution so people can see some remediation. And then from there, how can we ensure that that fund is replenished and can help anyone who might be facing this moving forward? So this is a key issue for ADK Action, and I know for a lot of you in this room. So we're going to keep working on it together.
Great, thanks so much. Yep, I think we've actually hit our time. It flew by. I know we have lots more questions. I do, everyone does. I really appreciate all the panelists. I appreciate DEC and DOT showing that they are committed to continuing this conversation. We're committed to continuing to press you guys on what you're doing, what you're working on, and we'll hopefully hold more of these types of events in the future. So thanks to everybody again. Thanks to everyone who came out. Thanks to the Wild Center for hosting us. Really excellent hosts. So I'm sure, if you guys, this is a reporter trick. If you stand between the door and the person you want to talk to, you can get a question out of them. So good luck with that. Thanks a lot.